Hello and welcome to The Art of Conversation, a radio show dedicated to a college course dedicated to the art of conversation. This program is brought to you by the Eileen G. Jones Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism at Commonwealth University here in beautiful Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Eric C. Miller, Professor of Communication Studies. We have a very distinguished guest joining us in the studio today, but before I introduce him, I'd like to do a little bit of scene setting. Because this is our first inaugural episode, it seems appropriate to explain what this show is about. Each semester, I teach a class available in your course catalog as Honors 211, The Art of Conversation, that focuses on the ancient art of dialectic. That is, the collaborative process by which knowledgeable peers pursue the truth through focused question and answer, back and forth, what is often called Socratic discussion. After a few weeks of wading through the theory on these matters, our students spend about 10 weeks in practice, holding twice weekly 75-minute deep dives into topics and questions of their choosing. Our theme this semester is the state of the earth and the good life upon it, granting students considerable leeway in their choice of content. Every week, twice a week, we're talking about how to live better lives on this planet. I found these exchanges so profitable in semesters past that I've decided to take them public this time around, incorporating a radio element into the grade scale. This means that each week I will sit down with a pair of student moderators to record a condensed version of their in-class conversation. This recording will then air locally on WHSK and be available for digital sharing online. From time to time, the students will get a break, and then I'll sit down instead with a member of the CU faculty or maybe a local civic leader to discuss the issues then weighing on their hearts and minds. Today, in fact, is one such day. My guest today is Dr. Peter Doerschler, Professor of Political Science and Program Director of the Honors College at Bloomsburg. Professor Doerschler is a graduate of Bucknell University just down the road with a PhD from Penn State. He has researched and written on a wide range of topics, including immigration, European politics, climate change, and globalization. But today he joins me to discuss the state of democracy specifically at home and abroad. As the 2024 U.S. presidential election draws closer and as passions are stirred throughout the land, I can think of no one better to help us understand this moment in this place. Dr. Doerschler, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Eric. Pleasure to be here.
Let's start in the here and now. We are recording at the end of September, major presidential election just a few weeks away. How are you feeling? What are you thinking about the state of American democracy?
Well, these are difficult times. I think that's a good place to start. Anxiety in the air, a lot of people following the news, following events, and with a few weeks left, we're all anxious to see what's going to happen in the election. Of course, we have two candidates in our two-party system, and they could not be more different from each other. And it seems as if there's very little wiggle room to move one way or another, very few undecided voters. If you haven't decided at this point who you're going to vote for, just stay home, probably. So I think this election, and this is not uncommon, we've heard this again and again in past years, that elections are important, and each election is more important than the next. But truly, this election, there is so much at stake in terms of where our country's going to go and what may happen to our democracy, that we all need to pay attention to this and understand the ramifications behind our vote.
The United States has been no stranger to closely run and bitterly challenged elections, dating back as far as 1800 with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. But the way we talk about this one and the last few suggests that they are substantively different somehow. And so I'm wondering, in your view, is this election different from those in the past, or is it just more of the same but with the volume turned up?
Well, certainly there are some similarities if we look at the core institutions, the two-party system that I just mentioned. And in a presidential election year, we have multiple elections happening at the state, federal, local level. If we look at things on paper, things don't look that much different. It's when we dig into the substance of this election where it becomes quite different and where the stakes could not be higher. I think what defined elections past was a lot of content, a lot of substance. Certain issues, and those issues would vary, election by election. Often the economy would weigh at the top and, be the most critical issue. But depending on the state of the country and whether we were involved abroad in a war or there was another important issue that was galvanizing support and motivating people to get out there, we could have some honest, hard, challenging, substantive debates around the issues. And certainly we're having those this year as well. But I think in addition to that, one of the most fundamental questions that we're grappling with is where the country is going to go, not just economically, not just on any particular policy issue, but whether or not we're going to hold on to some fundamental beliefs, core beliefs, democratic values, or whether perhaps we have exhausted those. And there are plenty of people out there right now that I think are yearning for a different type of system. And when if they're going to succeed, it really means perhaps transitioning to a new type of government. And those are things we have to be aware of that are, again, beyond just substantive issues. It's really reframing the direction of our country and the type of political system we wish to have.
When you mention folks out there wanting to switch to a different type of government or a different system, are you thinking of anyone in particular or any particular type of system that stands ready to replace what we have now?
Well, I think maybe you would start with looking at some approval ratings and support for various institutions and democracy overall in the United States. All of these different indicators of how our public perceives our political system, various institutions and actors, if they're not at all-time lows, they're very close to that. So congressional approval ratings, the state of our government, state of our country, even approval ratings for the Supreme Court have gone down dramatically just in the last few years. And I think collectively, this is weighing on people. There's no longer a belief that our current system is the right one because we're not getting the job done. We're not addressing some of the most important issues of the day. Pick any out of a hat. You could start with climate change if you want. The United States is not responding to a very challenging issue like this, at least at the federal level, with substantive laws and legislation that's going to, meet the needs of this issue and adopting to renewable energy sources and regulating fossil fuels and so on. So I think because we're failing at, or our system really is failing at addressing a lot of core issues, many of them across the board. Immigration, immigration system has been broken for a long time. Climate change, and people struggling kind of day to day while we still have enormous wealth and potential. So people look across the spectrum, and they see a system that is not adequately addressing all these issues. And I think that's where this kind of turn happens away from a system that's failing and people yearning for something different. And that's pushing them in the direction of not what I would consider healthy alternatives, institutional changes within our democracy. And maybe we can come back to this point, but I would argue that our democracy, the way it was founded and structured and set up, has some inherent flaws in it that have been key contributors to this problem. So instead of thinking about those solutions, which are difficult because they require a certain amount of knowledge, not just about our system the way it is, but what the alternatives are and how they would reshape our politics. But the easy solutions, I think, for a lot of people are to imagine a type of system that is quick and efficient, where a single power player can push buttons and get things done. It's part of our instant gratification culture, and I think that's what people want because that's what we're used to getting.
Yeah, when you had said that, my first thought went to Viktor Orban in Hungary, in part because I know there are people on the right, up to and including J.D. Vance, who are really interested in his model of, I guess, what he calls illiberal democracy. And of course, Donald Trump checked him in the debate and talked about what a great leader he is. And I thought that was really interesting because he's something more in the autocratic sort of a mold. I don't know. Have you studied his government at all, and have any thoughts on its prospects for the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly spent some time looking into Hungarian politics, and there would be other models, let's say, beyond Hungary, even though that is the one that former President Trump often references. So that's a good starting point. But you could look at Marine Le Pen in France, you could look at the Law and Justice Party in Poland, you could look at the new Prime Minister in Italy, Meloni, and Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, just to kind of keep sort of Western Europe, our kind of closest comparison cases in mind for the moment. So there are plenty of examples out there for people to point to, but Orban seems to be the one that not Trump and other allies of his on the right point to first and foremost. And he is probably the one in his Fidesz party that have consolidated power the most among all the examples that I just gave, that he has now a stranglehold on power. And I think that's the ambitions that those on the right have, to kind of follow in that wake and construct a system around a central power figure just like Orban. So Trump imagines that, and others out there, would-be voters and allies, see this as a model to follow. And it has autocratic tendencies for sure, because it is illiberal, meaning, core freedoms and liberties are not extended to everybody in the same way. And while there may be elections, the elections themselves are, they're kind of carried out in a way that give enormous advantage to his particular party. So, Trump is fond of saying the system is rigged. In Hungary, the system truly is rigged, the way the electoral system is set up, preferencing his party. So all of these things giving great advantage to one individual who's then able to kind of carry out his agenda over the objections of opposition leaders. And that leads to all kinds of potential pitfalls for democracy when we start talking about illiberal actions, denying freedoms and liberties to certain members of society, or pushing them out or scapegoating them. George Soros would be sort of the prime example of somebody who was picked on by the regime, scapegoated, and basically driven out. His entire university, in fact, was driven out of Hungary and had to relocate. And others, I think, are feeling that same heat, basically, from the regime. So there's a lot of identity politics, there's not a lot of nationalism, and of course there's populism. There's a groundswell of popular support centered around identity politics that's driving all of this.
So do you think then that Trump is a threat to democracy?
Yeah, I think certainly if you listen to what he says, if we step back and actually listen to what he says and what is contained in some core documents like Project 25 that envisions a type of government, and he's projecting the types of things that he wants to do, either to gain more power, or once he's in power, the things he's going to do that would enable him to pretty much get what he wants over any sort of what we think of as checks and balances in our system currently that would prevent autocratic power. So I think that is his tendency. He's even said, I think with a little wry, smirk, that he would only be dictator for a day. But that's hardly funny when you follow it up with the sorts of plans that would empower yourself and, prosecute opposition leaders, and go after the media, the mainstream media, people who aren't fair to him. I mean, over and over again, we hear the types of things that other autocratic leaders say and do to consolidate their power. There's a dictator's playbook out there, and I think they're all following more or less the same game plan and how you come to power. It's no longer power by coup. Right, that's sort of the old way of doing things, and you can point to successful coups in the past, and there have been a couple recent ones in Africa, but the countries that we're referencing today, it's not a would-be dictator harnessing the power of a disillusioned military to overthrow civilian government. It's more about eroding the guardrails of democracy, finding kinks in the armor, the Achilles heel of democracy, and figuring out how to bring it down from inside.
Trump has complained about this a little bit because there's been so much discussion about him as a quote unquote threat to democracy. He said in the debate, in fact, that he thought that was a reason why he had been fired upon by a would-be assassin. And then since then, there has been another attempt, apparently. And so I'm wondering if you've thought at all about like this strange seeming uptick in political violence. I mean, I don't think there has been an assassination attempt made on a candidate or president prior to this since 1982. And now apparently it's happened twice in the last few months. Does that speak to the health of our democracy in any way, or is that something you've given thought to?
Yeah, it should be of great concern to all of us. Violence is never the way to solve our political differences. And yet, increasingly, I think it's what people are thinking about. And the two assassination attempts, and we should condemn them automatically. And on left, right, everybody, there's no room for accepting that sort of behavior. I just would like to bring out a couple of statistics. This is from a recent NPR poll that I was looking at, and they speak to your point here about the role of violence. So in the poll, 1 out of 5 Americans think that violence may solve our divisions. 1 out of 5 Americans, 20%, they think violence may solve our divisions, something that may be necessary. How do we get beyond our divisions other than some form of violence? And I think we've been so conditioned to accepting violence in our society with all of the mass shootings, with the 2 recent assassination attempts, with January 6th, obviously, that the idea of violence playing a role in political change, I think, has become normalized to some extent. We almost expect it because that's what we read on the news every day. And the fact that 20% of Americans think it can be part of the solution to our divisions is alarming, because it only takes after an election, a contested election, when tempers flare, or if there is a particular state that takes much longer to count ballots. Georgia would be a good example right now because they've just made some changes to their election counting. That all it takes is, and we're washing guns and ammo and other weapons, and I think it's a powder keg ready to go, and we just hope that people restrain themselves. But these statistics tell us that there are lots of people out there that are almost anticipating violence happening. Let me see a couple of other quick statistics from this poll. 3/4 of prospective voters express concern about the possibility of violence. So again, it's a possibility. They're expressing concern about the possibility of violence, 3/4. So it's driving up anxiety. I know just in my interactions with students, first-year students in particular, we talked about different stressors in their lives. And it really could be anything, right? For students, it's schoolwork, it's the pressure of doing well. There are financial stressors. But I was surprised in the survey that I gave to my class, anonymous survey, how many students indicated politics as one of these stressors. And it may not rise to the top. It's not going to replace the academic pressure, the financial strains, but it's something that is out there. And something we talked about in class, because we went through the different issues and we spent a long time on that. And as we talked about it, more and more students kind of came out, because in the survey they had limited options. And so the kind of opening it up for discussion brought out additional concerns for students. So I think it's out there. People don't want to talk about it because politics is the verboten part of our conversation when we sit down with our friends and family, because we don't want to lose our friends and family, and we don't want to have heated exchanges. And unfortunately, we're in a place with our politics where civil discourse is lost to a large degree, and because of the passion and the things at stake for a lot of people, it drives us to get really heated and even potentially think about violence in our elections. And then, sorry to go on, but let me just give you one more quick statistic. In this poll from NPR, only 1/4 of those polled feel very confident in a peaceful transfer of power. Again, only 1/4 of those polled feel very confident in a peaceful transfer of power. So 75% of us are less than very confident. I think that includes confident, but with some, trepidation that our transfer of power is not going to be peaceful. And this is following January 6th. It is still fresh. There's a wound there because while so many instigators have been prosecuted, the potential for it to happen again, and President Trump's role is still being adjudicated in the courts and in public opinion. And there's so many people out there who are either not concerned by it or are willing to laugh it off, give it a free pass, or just not be that concerned about it. And yet we saw very nearly we had casualties, but mass casualties. We almost saw the overturning of the electoral count and possibly not a peaceful transfer of power. I mean, it wasn't, but the actual counting itself could have been disrupted in a way that we would have not had a free and fair election in the end. And who knows what would have happened then if Pence hadn't done his job. So there's a lot to be concerned about here, and just digging into some public opinion and trying to read some tea leaves of how Americans think about this and the fear, the anxiety, the anticipation that violence is going to follow us in a few short weeks when we vote again.
I want to talk more about the January 6th stuff, but before that, I'd like to cycle back to something you had said earlier about the anxiety that people are feeling going into this election, because I've had this conversation in my class, and a lot of students report feeling that they are somewhat misled or manipulated by the news media. And in particular, the point that I hear again and again is that, to the extent that the news media has a partisan bias one way or the other, the bigger bias is a financial incentive to get clicks and shares and viral stories. And if you want people to click your link or share your story, you need to give it like a sensational headline. You need to like stir people up, make them angry or scared or frustrated. Some of the same emotions that politicians routinely tap into to get people to the polls. And so I'm wondering, since the news media is considered so central to democracy, is it possible that the way it functions now could become threatening to democracy?
Certainly, I think it's kind of a Wild West media landscape right now. And people no longer trusting what we would generally call mainstream news. A lot of, credible news sources out there on the left, on the right, centrist, some with stronger editorial boards with stronger political opinions than others, and some, maybe like the AP or something like that is really just geared towards pumping out objective stories. So there's a shift away from that for sure, and driven by more sensational headlines, things that get likes and follows and get forwarded and shared. And we're all susceptible to, the doom scrolling and addicted to our devices. And I think there's a certain amount of ease to fall into those traps of cycling through the same stories that evoke a lot of fear and anxiety among people. The politics of fear, the using fear as a motivator for people. And I think that's front and center in this election as well, and has been a critical piece of the last couple of elections too. So much, not just negative advertising, because that has been around for a while and it's been shown to be a very effective tool in swaying voters and motivating them to come out, right? Sort of fear of what happens of somebody getting into office or targeting a particular policy position or quality of a candidate. But I think the types of things we're seeing now, again, what makes this election different is moving beyond just negative advertising and really centering on more existential questions that our political system is fundamentally at risk. And if our political system is at risk, our quality of life may be threatened. And then our inability to address a lot of the issues that we discussed at the very beginning, right? There's a ripple effect, there's a domino effect. And so it's not an isolated one election, in every election cycle, right? We all get a little worked up about it, and easy to do because we see the kind of what's at stake, and we form, a lot of us fairly deep attachments with our preferred candidates, and there's a lot riding on it and so forth. But I think this goes even deeper. The existential nature and the ripple effect of this election just has created so much more stress and anxiety for people. We have to acknowledge that, and we've got to find a way to move beyond it. And I'm very hopeful that after this upcoming election, we can kind of normalize our politics again to some degree. But I would say that too is going to be difficult because the institutions that we have in place are ripe for exploitation. What we're experiencing now, I think, can be repeated without a doubt. And until we sort of address more fundamental issues in our political system and our institutions, I don't think we're going to, quote unquote, solve the problem. I think it's going to keep coming. It's going to be like a repeating nightmare, just coming back to us again and again. At least I think there's potential for that.
When you say we need to address more fundamental issues, like what do you have in mind, for example?
Well, I think, scholars point to, not to go too into all the poli-sci stuff here, but I would say very fundamentally for your listeners, if they can imagine an incongruity between a couple sets of our institutions, and it gets right to the heart of what democracy is and how we're unable to fulfill our democratic obligation because of institutions. So let me elaborate. We have a winner-take-all electoral system. And you know how elections run. Let's just say in the House, for example, we have a district here in Pennsylvania. We have two parties, at least Republicans, Democrats, there may be additional parties. We know that the party with the most votes wins that seat. And this is replicated over and over again, 435 times in our House of Representatives. So we are left with two parties that are generally going to get all the different seats, and there's reasons for that and the consolidation of power behind those two parties. But when you have two parties, one in power, one in opposition, that's kind of a hallmark of what we call majoritarian democracy, where a majority has the power, they get to make decisions, and the majority here represented by the party that has the most seats in Congress, and then a party in opposition. And oppositions are fundamental part of democracy. They're there to hold the majority accountable. If the majority slips, if they take a wrong turn, if they propose something outlandish, even unconstitutional, potentially, right? The opposition is there to point this out, to talk about it in the media, to try to galvanize support among the public. And there are other guardrails too, but the opposition would play a central one. So in a majoritarian democracy with this type of setup, a majority in power and opposition, it should be, in theory, relatively easy to make decisions, right? Majority wields the power, majority makes decisions. And given all of the different challenges that we face on paper, we should be able to address them. We don't know how, depends on the party in power, but address them we should be able to. And yet, what do we see over and over again? Years, decades of just gridlock and inability to come together. And why is that? Well, because of all the different checks and balances and veto players, we also call them, in our system, that just having a majority in one branch of Congress doesn't allow you to just do whatever you want. You have to pass through all these other hoops. So there's the Senate. Okay, we have a bicameral legislature. There is the filibuster in the Senate. So now you need a 60-seat majority, a super majority that you have to pass through. And if the House and the Congress are held by different parties, right? That is an enormous bar to cross, that the parties are somehow going to form some sort of legislation, and you get both of them on board to rise over that 60-seat supermajority in the Senate and overcome the filibuster. And then you have, if you want to look at state and local politics too, sort of there's a federal structure, there are checks and balances in our branches of government, and then there's gerrymandering, which shouldn't be forgotten and needs to be entered into this equation too. What partisan gerrymandering has done is create many, many districts out there, and again, just sticking to the House of Representatives for the moment, that are not competitive. They're not competitive districts. We have gerrymandered them. We've drawn these districts in a way that advantages one party over another, where the outcome is more or less assured. And if you don't have a competitive election, you don't have discourse. You don't have discussions. You don't have debates. You know ahead of time who's going to win an election. So you add all of these things together, and the incongruity of a majority in a majoritarian-style democracy that should be able to be efficient. That's the hallmark of this style of government, because one party wielding power, being efficient, getting things done. But with all of our veto players, with all of our complexities in our system, filibuster, gerrymandering, bicameral legislature, presidential veto, which I didn't even mention before, all of these things taken together means that we have to seek compromise in order to form a majority across all these different actors to pass the legislation that we need. So that majority in the House turns into needing compromise and a consensus across all these different actors. And so that's where things kind of don't work. We're expecting a majority to get things done, but it can't, because it's held up by all these other hoops and hurdles and veto players. And that's what drives people to get frustrated when our government can't get things done. And that's what leads presidents increasingly to talk about executive orders or decrees, or start to use the language of autocrats, because they're under pressure to get things done by their constituents, by their voters. They need to make promises to voters out there that they're going to be effective, because our political system isn't effective. And I think that's what's leading us down this road of, entertaining the idea of autocracy, because at least a president can get things done. We just need to empower him to be able to do that.
When you were talking about the non-competitive districts, it reminded me that we have something in the neighborhood of 44 non-competitive states in the presidential election because of the Electoral College. And I'm somewhat familiar with the reasons why we have the Electoral College, or why it was first baked into the system, but it seems to me that it doesn't really succeed in making the whole country relevant to a presidential election, since this one will be decided basically in 6 or 7 states. And so I'm wondering, do you think that the Electoral College factors into this matter of people losing faith in democracy? Or is it a worthwhile institution?
It certainly has some, justification. There's reasons why it's there. But I do think if and I'll start maybe with public opinion, some of the recent polls that I've seen over the last 5 years or so, somewhere between 65 and 80% of Americans surveyed think the Electoral College should go. The time has come. So there's a pretty wide consensus out there that it no longer reflects the will of the people. It's no longer a necessary tool. And of course, the origins were to take power out of the hands of ordinary people, right? If you have these electors, these elites who can ultimately be the arbiters in an election and make the final decision, that's sort of a safeguard. That was seen as a guardrail for democracy, because certainly we don't want to let ordinary people make decisions. But I think as a lot of us have come to realize that that core element in our presidential election, sort of the direct vote for the candidate that we prefer, is being kind of taken out of our hands. And while most of the time that doesn't make a substantive difference, we have seen lately a couple of elections in 2000 and 2016 where the loser of the popular vote won the Electoral College. And it's a very likely scenario for this upcoming election as well. If you look on 538 website, they kind of break down the probability of different election scenarios kind of crossing popular vote with Electoral College vote. So it's almost assured that Harris is going to win the popular vote. Strange things could happen, right? But if we look at the past couple of elections in particular, and she is sort of as an incumbent, I know as vice president, but still as an incumbent, a lot of the same issues in place, facing off against the same challenger, that we can anticipate that she's going to win the popular vote. But there's a very good chance that she could lose the Electoral College. And it's about a 45-55 or even a coin toss sort of flip right now. So it's on a knife's edge. It could go either way. It's going to come down to, in the Electoral College, 6 or 7 states that are going to decide the outcome. And all of the money and the resources, the intention, all the pressure on those particular states, on the election officials to make sure that that the votes go off without a hitch, without any technical glitches, or all the scrutiny that's going to be paid by armies of lawyers on either side. This is what we come down to, basically. A type of election that, again, generates so much stress and anxiety because so much is at stake in a system that is so problematic that at the end may not represent the will of the majority. And that eats at the very core essence of democracy. If this happens, if this becomes a trend, and it seems like it has, or the possibility of it happening almost every election now is certainly very real, that the Electoral College is a counter majority institution. It's working against the majority, and isn't the majority what democracy should be, the will of the majority, while protecting, of course, the freedoms and liberties of the minority. But that's where the Constitution comes into play. There are safeguards and guardrails for that. So we have an institution that is undermining democracy, and I think public opinion would also support the idea that its time has come. And why not focus on what's happening in New York or Alabama or California? Why not reach out to those voters who probably feel so disenfranchised now because forever they've been neglected in federal elections because the outcome is predetermined. And instead, they get to watch what happens in Pennsylvania. Good for us, I suppose, but detrimental to the overall health of democracy if the debate is so centralized or localized in only a very, very few places. We're losing the idea that democracy should involve everybody into this discourse and into this process. It's just not.
I want to ask you about Kamala Harris for a minute, because one of the weird things about this election, obviously, is that the candidate who made his way through the Democratic primary and won it dropped out, and then was replaced by a candidate who did not go through the primary process. And I know some people have raised concerns about that on its face. And so I wonder, does Kamala Harris getting the Democratic nomination the way that she did raise concerns for you?
Yeah, I think for me personally, I would have liked to see a little more open process of vetting and allow more voices to come into the process to decide who that was going to be. Like let's get back to the idea of letting the cream rise to the top and letting the candidates square off, and let's have a debate, and let's see who's going to, resonate with the voters more, and the democratic process, basically, that we have established in our primaries. And Harris, didn't do very well in 2020. And so I think there's plenty of people out there who remember that and wonder, that's still sort of images of her floundering in debates and kind of being pretty harsh towards Biden. And, he kind of turned around and forgave her. But lingering questions about her suitability, her strengths, her ability overall to step into this, all-important role. And we don't know enough about the other candidates, Gretchen Whitmer, or, just to name one, but there are a dozen different candidates probably that we could point to and say they possess, at least the potential to be a good president. Let's hear from them. And so we didn't do that. I understand why, given the timing and the need to consolidate around a candidate and get the messaging down and prepare for a debate. And so I think in the long run, we'll probably not remember this too much, especially if she wins. Of course, we'll just kind of forget it. But it would have been nice in a democracy to have that open debate, and there might have been a window to do it. It would have complicated the picture, of course. And it might have hurt the Democrats in the end because it would have exposed more fissures in the party and set maybe some Democrats against each other on wedge issues on different things. So again, I understand the elites in the party consolidating, and Gretchen Whitmer was one of the first to consolidating around her for the good of the party and not their own personal ambitions, but sort of sidestepping this democratic process.
So you'd mentioned earlier that there was some percentage of the voting population that was concerned that we are about to witness something other than a peaceful transfer of power. And I'll place myself among that group because I think based on past precedent, if it is determined that Donald Trump has lost the Electoral College vote, I think we have every reason to expect that he will say that it was rigged. And at that point, given what we saw last time, I think all bets are off. And so in a way, like that's my biggest concern about this election, that it will be decided against Trump. He will challenge that result. And then who knows what happens from there. I'm wondering if you've considered any potential scenarios or if you're aware of any steps that are being taken to ensure a peaceful transfer of power.
Well, other than building an underground bunker, let me see. To ensure a peaceful transfer of power. So a couple of things were done. The Electoral Count Act was revised, which was, poorly written and left some ambiguities as to the vice president's role in the process. And it was a very old law, and I think now that it's been rewritten, there's greater clarity, there's less ambiguity. That definitely helps. And that's part of the process. So a president comes along, disputes the electoral, calls for a rigged election, and the electoral vote is not an accurate representation of what really happened in the election. As long as we have the different steps in place, electors, and we could go to the fake electors too, so that's another concern, but Electoral Count Act, the role of the vice president, certifying elections at local and state levels. These are all things that held last time, and I think in some cases they've been strengthened. But I also think that the enemies of democracy are, I don't know, they're a little more, they're smarter now than they were before. They've kind of probed weaknesses in the system. And it's going to be interesting to see where you go from saying it's a rigged election. What would that look like? And are there going to be actors who are willing to pick that up and run with it because they are loyal to an individual, not to the democratic process? And I think there may be people like that, right? The RNC is now captive to Trump. There are a lot more people who are, willing loyalists inside the party at different levels of government who are perhaps willing to go along with this rigged election idea. And I think 67% or thereabouts of Republicans today still believe in a rigged election. So I don't know. It's while some good things have happened, I think the overall fear is still there, and the enemies of democracy are emboldened because not enough has been done in terms of prosecuting these things. The fake electors, even January 6th, right? We still have a lot of loose ends there to tie up in the judicial system. So I'm so hopeful that this doesn't come to pass, but I feel your anxiety because I know that there are still ways to manipulate the election and the outcome, and that's what we're desperately trying to avoid.
Are you at all concerned about foreign interference in the election? I mean, last time around we were talking about Russian hackers and things trying to infiltrate our process. Have safeguards been put in place there? Or is that no longer a concern?
I think it's still a concern, and the Russians and there are other actors out there would like nothing more than, if not alter the outcome of our election, and I think that's almost secondary. It's almost secondary to say, hey, I prefer one candidate over the other, and we're going to try our best to get this person into power over that person. I think the end goal actually is to sow chaos. And if we are a house divided, we don't stand, or if the center doesn't hold, whatever kind of metaphor you want to use, then we're unable to respond to these bigger challenges. And for our enemies out there, including Russia, we take our eye off of the issues over in Ukraine or elsewhere. If you're China, maybe we don't respond as unified to an attack on Taiwan. If you're Iran, maybe we no longer have no longer backing Israel and trying to secure peace in the Middle East, right? There's all sorts of things that could happen if we are not unified that give an advantage to these autocratic states out there. So I think that's the ultimate goal, and they are definitely working very hard to sow chaos, disinformation into our system through deep fakes and other tools such as that, planting all sorts of crazy ideas and misrepresenting candidates in different ways to cause concern among voters, right? And either they stay home or they vote for a different candidate, or again, we're clashing with each other, the potential for violence. All of that stuff helps our enemies, doesn't help us whatsoever. And I have deep concern for that as well.
So just given everything that we've witnessed in American politics over the last 8 years, during this time when the future of democracy has been such a hot topic of conversation, do you see us trending in a positive direction or a negative direction in comparison to other countries around the world that have been going through these same issues? As you look ahead beyond this election, where do you see the United States headed?
Yeah, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. Seems like that's the podcast today. But yeah, I don't think the trend is particularly positive. Overall, if you look at what we call the backsliding of democracy, meaning the number of countries that are losing, not just becoming autocracies, but the quality of their democracy is diminishing, versus the number of countries whose democracies maybe are deepening or getting better, far more are actually losing out. They're part of the backslide. They're part of a reverse wave. There's different language that's used to sort of denote the countries that are experiencing slippage in the quality of their democracy and maybe becoming illiberal democracies or hybrid regimes of some type, or maybe even more solidly autocratic regimes. So there's definitely a trend in that direction. The past 18 years, according to Freedom House and other organizations who track this, basically say the same thing. And the United States is part of that. And interestingly, no region is immune from this. We tend to think of Africa and Middle East, right? These are the bastions of autocratic rule. And true enough, a much greater share of their regimes are autocratic than you'd find in Western Europe. But if you look at the backsliding is happening everywhere, every region of the world, and nobody is immune from it. Even democracies that are consolidated like ours, that have been around for a long time, and we have come to just accept that we're a democratic country and that's the way we're always going to be. But take a look over the last, not so much 18 years, but more like 10 years, as you said, and what's happened in the United States. We've seen a steady decline in democracy. And it's not, again, we're not talking about coups. We're not talking about a drastic overnight change. We're talking about a very slow devolving of democracy one year after another. And it's around things like attacks in the media, concerns about our free and fair elections, because there is a substantial portion of the population that believes in a rigged election, and attacks on opposition, right? Prosecuting members of a different party. These sorts of threats are what endanger our democracy when we're no longer feeling as open and free to share our beliefs with other people, or in the political sphere, members of opposition parties who have to worry about being prosecuted. Then that's when autocracy wins. And those things are out there affecting our democracy right now. Have we become autocratic? No. But are we moving slowly but surely in that direction? We are. And we have to be gravely concerned about that because of all the ripple effects that I mentioned before and so many different policies. We need to embark on some fundamental reforms. The Fair Representation Act, I'll just plug that. Go look it up, because ranked choice voting, multi-member districts, getting rid of partisan gerrymandering are the three core ideas behind the Fair Representation Act. That's something I think, if not that exactly, some form of institutional reform is necessary for us to regain our footing as a democracy where pluralism and civil discourse are the norm, and violence and the politics of fear are not.
Dr. Peter Doerschler, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much, Eric. I had a pleasure doing this.
I'd like to go ahead and thank our sponsors here at Commonwealth University of Pennsylvania, especially the Honors College and the Department of Communication Studies, Media, and Journalism. This has been The Art of Conversation. We'll see you next week.